Here we go. It is hour number 3 of the G-Bag Nation on 105.3 The Fan. It is time for our conversation with Nick Harris, Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Be on his way to the Combine next week, and Nick joins us now here on The Fan. And a good afternoon, sir. How the heck are you?
Yeah, doing fantastic, fellas. Weather is fantastic. Getting ready to go to Indy, like you said. It's going to be a busy week.
Yeah, so what do you think's the hottest thing smoking right now around the Cowboys? Is it Pickens, Crosby, Minka, the players? Like, what's the top story right now as this offseason really gets underway?
Oh, yeah, certainly George Pickens. I think, you talk about those other conversations, right, with Max Crosby or Minka Fitzpatrick per se, and I think you could loop George Pickens into all of those conversations, right? I think with this negotiation / deal / franchise tag that they're going to have George Pickens work through over the course of the next few months, it's going to be very fascinating to see how it's tracked, because I think you could make a case for both sides that the franchise tag does make sense, and then you could also make a case for both sides that an extension makes sense. So, it's going to be interesting whenever these two sides finally do sit down at the table next week, what that's going to look like. But, with Indianapolis comes the opportunity for front office members to meet with everybody, everybody's representation, everybody's agent, and George Pickens is going to be no stranger to that for sure.
With George, I was surprised a couple of weeks ago when you started reporting on what you were hearing, like maybe worth a 2, maybe a 3 and a 4 would be the best offer you could get. What am I missing here? It seems like he's one of the best 6 or 7 receivers in the game, and is, really, really tough to bring down, like on a level as the other top wide receivers out there. I guess the market just doesn't trust that what we saw from George this year is what you would get over the next 5 years or so.
Yeah, and the market more so points to longevity, and if that longevity can be there and if it's proven to be there, I think some of the off-the-field stuff has also been, part of the conversation as well. And sure, yes, we got a George Pickens season in 2025 that absolutely, I agree with you, was top 5, top 6 best receiver in the NFL, and probably, showed that he should be worth that type of money. But I think when you look at the receiver market and you look at the receivers around the league, the ones that are paid the most and paid at the level of a CeeDee Lamb or Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, we've seen that type of production on a consistent basis. And I just don't know if that's been there for George Pickens, and that's probably why his worth is more so at a 2 rather than a 1. But I do think, at the end of the day, I don't see trade conversations happening unless things really do go sour. And as of right now, there's nothing sour with it.
Okay, so have you heard that the Cowboys are concerned with the late stuff or the off-the-field stuff? I mean, Jerry has publicly defended his, being late to meetings thing. Is there anything to this behind the scenes that the Cowboys are concerned with his level of professionalism?
No, I don't believe so, because there was an expectation of what that was going to look like whenever they did trade for him last offseason. And the Cowboys have shown throughout Jerry Jones' tenure as owner that they have a higher tolerance for these sorts of things. And so is it going to be brought up in the spirit of the negotiation? Absolutely, because that's a way you could potentially get the price down with a reasonable context. But is it a huge deal that, the Cowboys look at and they see as something that they don't want in the future? I don't necessarily see that.
Nick, when we talk about George Pickens and him as an asset, I always love talking about the team building stuff with you and the draft stuff. I mean, every year we see in the draft, these receiving classes are awesome. I mean, is it beneficial to have 2 receivers that are $30+ million when maybe you could trade one to get a stud defensive player, maybe add more picks, and then you could go ahead and attack that and fill wide receiver 2 with a cheaper asset in the draft? I mean, what are your thoughts on that big picture scale?
Yeah, and I don't think there's a wrong answer when you consider that, and I think it is a fascinating conversation to have. But the question I would bring up is how confident are you that you can actually find that wide receiver too? I think if you point back to 2024, there were at times where they wish they certainly had that. Brandon Cooks couldn't stay healthy. They wanted Jalen Tolbert to emerge into that role, and while he did have a good year in 24, he never quite fulfilled that. And then in 25, they just address it in the offseason, and they go get a guy like George Pickens. Now, do they feel like, hey, if we want to trade George Pickens and spend a first or second round pick, depending on what you get for him, on a elite type receiver in this draft, how confident are you that guy can step in and be a wide receiver too? And if he can't, you're kind of screwed. And I think as far as maximizing this window that this team has, they understand that there's probably 3 years in this window. Do you want to waste one of those years to potentially developing a receiver, or would you rather, potentially swing on some guys in free agency on the defensive side and be able to make it work with that? But again, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that question. It's more so about what you feel more confident in the team being able to evaluate and put in place.
How much more emphasis does Christian Parker coming out and saying struggling to think of ways to defend that offense make Steven and Jerry think, man, that's even more reason why we need to keep Pickens around?
Yeah, and that for sure. And there was a conversation that we had with Clayton Adams, the offensive coordinator, coming out of the season. And it was, hey, what are you most excited to do now that you have a full off season to, look at everything and evaluate everything? Like, what are you most excited to, work on and toy with this off season? And he was like, look, we did some fantastic things last year on offense, but there is so much that we can do when you have two elite wide receivers like you have in CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens. It's rare in the NFL, and it's something that I can't wait to sit down at the whiteboard and figure out what we can do to scheme these guys open and get them both 1,500 yards in a season. And so that quote I keep coming back to, and I will probably continue to come back to as we go through this George Pickens ordeal. And, at the end of the day, I mean, all due respect to Clayton Adams, but he's not going to be the decision maker at the end of the day. But I think there are some thoughts behind the scenes of like, hey, we might only be tipping the iceberg, hitting the tip of the iceberg on what we can do with these two wide receivers.
Nick Harris, Star Telegram, with us here on The Fan. So he was talking about the importance of that nickelback position in his defense. What do you think their approach is in regards to trying to fill that void?
Yeah, I think there's going to be multiple options that they do have. I don't necessarily have their approach in hand right now. I think Indianapolis is going to be, a big determining factor in a lot of these types of conversations. But I think you will probably have an impact player in that spot. And whether that is trading for a guy like a Minka Fitzpatrick or it's going out in free agency, three nickels that I really do like in this free agency class. Alontae Taylor coming out of the New Orleans Saints, Roger McCreary coming out of the Los Angeles Rams, and D. Alford coming out of the Atlanta Falcons. I think all three of those guys bring kind of a different element to that nickel position that Christian Parker would potentially be looking for. And then you look in the draft. I mean, we've talked about Caleb Downs so much. I think he would be a day one starter at that slot position, and it could serve that versatility that Christian Parker would be looking for. But even if they can't get a Caleb Downs, if he doesn't slip to 12 or if they don't jump up and draft him in the top 10, Avion Terrell out of Clemson, I think that's another solid guy that they could put in that spot. They have options, and that's probably the fortunate part of it. But I wrote an article this morning in the Fort Worth Star Telegram. I was like, this is going to be the most important offseason addition for Christian Parker is what he decides to do at that nickelback spot because of the importance he laid on it in the press conference earlier this week and how successful his nickels have been on successful defenses he's been a part of. And so definitely something to keep an eye on moving forward.
How are you viewing the defensive end in that edge spot now with the odd man fronts that Christian Parker's looking to use, maybe some of the spacing? Do you think you have enough confidence in the names that could be available at 12 and 20 that they could be instant impact guys, or there may be some free agent names that you're considering there too?
You're talking at edge specifically?
At edge, yes, sir.
Yeah, I think edge, you're in a fortunate class here in this first round with 2 picks to potentially swing on an edge. I think I like the edge group that would probably be available at 20. Guys like Cassius Howell or even Romello Height. I kind of teeter back and forth on Keldrick Falk, but I'm going to stick with it. I think he still would be, a valuable addition to this defense. However, they have to address that position in free agency, like you said, Zach. There's no way they can get around it. They need to add multiple bodies at that position in free agency because they need veterans in those spots, and they need guys that can get after the passer and not to say the first-round picks are project types, but you don't necessarily know what you're going to get out of those guys. I do think this scheme change certainly benefits a guy like Donovan Ezaraku, though. I think you're going to see him more productive in pass rush situations next year, but he's going to need running mates, and he can't just have Jadeveon Clowney. I think if you were to spend big at any position this offseason, it would obviously have to be edge.
You mentioned a Minka Fitzpatrick trade there, Nick. I mean, have you given any thought to what that would look like? Like, could you get him for a day 3 draft pick?
Yeah, that's where it probably becomes a little tough. I don't think you could just I've seen somebody throw out like, hey, you could probably go get him for a 4th or a 5th. I don't think it would necessarily be that easy, just because thinking back to the trade deadline this past season, and granted, I know that's a long time ago when you're talking about contracts. Before the Quinnen Williams trade went through, there were heavy discussions about Minka Fitzpatrick. And when the Quinnen Williams trade went through, all those talks kind of got abandoned. And that makes me think that the same type of draft capital is being used in those same conversations. Now, is Minka Fitzpatrick worth a first or a second round pick? Probably. You're going to have to give up some premier draft capital, and it would probably have to sacrifice what you have in 27 as of today.
Wow, it's Nick Harris, Star Telegram, here with you in the G-Bag Nation. On that nickel idea, there was some talk on social media. I'm not sure where exactly it came from, but what about the idea of Marquise Bell? Is he ready for that big of a role, or would he be exposed there?
I think Marquise Bell is a football player. His position is FVP, and whenever Christian Parker was talking about, hey, that nickel corner, he's the guy that if you're playing football in the neighborhood, he's your first-round draft pick because he has instincts, he knows the game so well. Marquise Bell jumps out as a type of player like that. I don't know if he could be that consistent guy in that role, but I think in a rotational role, absolutely. I mean, we've seen him play safety, linebacker, nickel corner at times here early in his career with the Cowboys, and obviously he's been fantastic on special teams. That's how he got his second contract, but I think, Marquise Bell being that type of rover piece for this defense, it makes sense for the current personnel that they have in place, but I still do think they need to go get an impact guy there, a guy who has either proven to do it or a guy who has that top 15 draft capital type worth to be able to play from that spot and expect production out of that spot.
What are you hearing about the feeling about running back right now? Not only whom they currently have with Blue and Maffa, but the situation with Williams, and if he asks for X amount, is there a number maybe that they don't want to go over?
Yeah, things are a little bit interesting now, I think you could say, for Javonte Williams. I don't think it's as given as it was maybe even 2-3 weeks ago that he ends up back on this roster. He's changed representations, and that's going to completely change the negotiation that happens with Javonte Williams next week. He currently does not have an agent, so if they were to sit down with anybody, it would have to be Javonte at the end of the day. So I think if you had asked the Cowboys about a month ago, they would have expected, hey, we have a pretty good chance of locking him up before we even get out of Indianapolis, but now things are a little bit different there, and I think they're going to have to evaluate the market a little bit more and look far and wide. Granted, Javonte Williams wants to be back at Dallas, so that's going to be the plus that they do have in that type of realm. But what does that contract look like? Are they going to give him a deal similar to some of the running back deals that were given out last offseason? Is he worth a double-digit $1 million contract? I don't know if he's necessarily worth that. So there's going to be some big conversations had. Rico Dowdle still lives in Dallas, has said during Super Bowl week that he wouldn't mind being back in Dallas either. So there's going to be options. I don't think, for me, the dream is Kenneth Walker. If he somehow has ended up in free agency, I think that would be a huge home run. But I think this running back conversation maybe is, I would call it fluid right now for sure. I would still predict Javonte Williams as the guy at the end of the day, but I would consider it fluid, no doubt.
Nick Harris with you here. What happened with Logan Wilson? Like, what just didn't come together for him?
Yeah, the production just wasn't there, the speed, the athleticism. I mean, we saw that on the field, right? And this was a full expectation. Shoot, even when they traded for him at the trade deadline, is that they were probably going to have to either A, part ways with him at this point, or B, restructure a contract to make it more team-friendly at the end of the day. He had no guaranteed money left on his deal. He was counting $6.5 million toward the cap in 2026. I mean, shoot, there's your running back money right there. And so that probably that played a big role into it. And if Logan Wilson wants to find his way back to Dallas, it's probably on a cheaper $1 to $2, maybe even $3 million type deal.
All right, so you got the $21.5 million cap hit for Kenny Clark. How do they figure out a way to make this, to fix that, I should say, and him still remain on the team?
Yeah, very similar conversation. The difference is, though, that Kenny Clark had production, right? And so he has no guaranteed money left on his contract either. I don't see how that $21.5 million cap hit could stand. And so they are definitely going to have to sit down with Kenny Clark and figure out what that contract looks like. And sooner rather than later. Free agency is quickly approaching on us. We're less than a month out. And, restructures for Dak, CD, even Tyler Smith, once those are in the pocket, then you have to figure out a guy like Kenny Clark, and then you start talking about the Terrence Steeles and the Malik Hookers of the world, and figuring out where you can open up more space to go be aggressive in free agency. And so, yeah, Kenny Clark is definitely a huge part of that conversation, no doubt.
Would you be restructuring with Osa and Deron Bland and being aggressive to get the maximum amount of space, or do you think they'll be slow playing those?
Deron Bland probably is slow playing that for sure, because as Deron Bland's current contract situation is laid out, they have an out next offseason. And given the injury history that he's run up into over the course of the last couple of seasons with his foot surgeries, that's probably the smart route, is to let the current structure of the contract play out. And with Osa Odighizuwa, I mean, it's kind of team choice at that point, whether they want to, push those guarantees further down the line, or if they want to continue having them front loaded. That would be more so team preference and how they view spending all that money at the defensive tackle position.
Have a blast in Indianapolis at the Combine. Nick, can't thank you enough for your insights, and we look forward to catching up with you on the other side.